The mining sector is in focus now as the World Trade Organization, the WTO, warns of a slowdown in trade growth this year, which has led to a warning from the International Monetary Fund, the IMF, to say that global growth is now in a precarious position. Well, despite this, China has seen a recovery in its latest PMI readings. For more on what all this means for the mining sector, a sector that has its eyes on the moon as well to expand its resource base, John Mayer might join us now from SP Angel. John, welcome. I want to go to the moon in just a few moments' time, if we can, to take a look at that. But also keep in mind as well, Brexit in the context of this slowdown that we're hearing about. Should we be worried at the moment in the mining sector because of what's happening globally?
Well, we should always be worried about what's going to happen in the mining sector because it is a volatile space. But let's contextualize this. Last year, we had coordinated global growth. The US, China and Europe all growing relatively well, except for one or two sort of spots. And of course, then Donald Trump came along and shook things up a bit and said, we're going to have a bit of a trade war here. The Chinese have been taking the mickey on a number of levels, intellectual theft, dumping certain commodities into Europe and the US, particularly the US. And he said, look, let's stop the music here. We're gonna have some discussions on this. Everybody got a bit worried. I think last November, December, investors got nervous. Growth started to pull back as well because manufacturers said, well, we're uncertain about the environment. Chinese manufacturers slowed down a bit. The US carried on growing relatively well, actually, through all of that. And then, of course, throw into the mix, we had a bit of a slowdown starting in Europe with Brexit, German manufacturers taking a much more cautious view, Italy in recession anyway. In fact, Germany should have been in recession. There were just some funny things going on with the numbers there. Curiously enough, the weird thing is that the UK has carried on growing relatively well. And some people are saying that's due to stocking ahead of Brexit. And I think what's going on in Europe is with German manufacturers are saying, ooh, we're not sure if we're going to be able to sell so much into the UK for a while. So we've got to be very cautious here, and that's creating more of a slowdown there. So that has caused the global economy, all of that, to dampen down a bit. So growth rates are now revised to about half of what we were last year. But the world hasn't fallen off a cliff. The sky's not fallen on our heads either. Yes, the WTO have revised down their global growth numbers. What a surprise. But there is still growth. The US, if we look at the US 10-year Treasury bond yield, that went negative very briefly, which means that you're paying them to look after your money. But we're back into positive territory again, which means that people are a bit more optimistic about the future. And I think once we're over a few headwinds, we'll be back into growth again.
What sort of metals respond to this slowdown in growth? I mean, clearly, if growth slows down, there's less building, less construction, less everything that goes on to help build our lives. What metals in particular respond to this sort of negative swing?
Copper has always been seen as the major metal for trading, and it's partly because it has lots of liquidity and it's well linked to global growth. But remember that copper is also going to find new growth from electric vehicles, and the growth rates for that are looking quite good. And in fact, the data is underpinning quite a lot of that now. And people are beginning to wake up to the idea and the concept that actually a lot of new charging stations are going to use a lot of copper. It's not just the vehicles, but it's the charging points and cabling those up and upgrading the grid systems that's important there. So copper was always the main thing. But if we look at the other industrial metals, we've seen buyers standing back in things like vanadium and titanium and certain other metals. Actually, titanium wasn't so bad, but we've been looking at vanadium a lot and watching the price come down, which was a bit surprising. But it's really just buyers being cautious and saying, well, we're not quite sure whether the UK is going to pay for these construction projects in Europe going forwards. So maybe we shouldn't be building quite so much or making quite so much steel for the bridges and the road projects, some of which will probably be delayed. I suspect the European Parliament won't cancel things, but I bet you they'll delay a number of projects if the UK has a hard Brexit and the 15 billion euros a year comes back out. So there are some meaningful things that happen there. But what we think is the market for these metals, and particularly vanadium, will recover. The Chinese certainly have allowed the smaller steel mills not to worry too much about the vanadium content in their steel. It would worry me a lot because I wouldn't want to be in one of those buildings where there's no real vanadium in the steel. But they are going to implement that and make sure there is full compliance later on in the year, and I think prices will pick up again. So when we look at these smaller metals, we're seeing what's going on at a more local level.
I was going to ask you about where is their insulation from the downturn. You mentioned electric vehicle, battery metals and so forth. You talk about copper in particular and vanadium. What about other metals that we hear about, the lithiums and some of the rare earth minerals? Are you seeing any slowdown in demand there in that particular space?
We've seen a pullback in prices in lithium. Lithium carbonate prices are just below $10,000 a tonne. And I think that's because producers are producing a bit more and the consumers are still ramping up what they're doing. And so I think there's going to be a seesawing in prices for lithium raw materials, this lithium carbonate and spodumene, over the next few years. But I still think prices will be relatively strong within that sector. Cobalt came back last year, and that was because there were an awful lot of diggers finding their shovels in the Congo and things like that. But yes, we are seeing nickel prices, and we see nickel as actually having a very strong market in future years because it's very expensive metal to produce. But the prices came back, and I think that's a sort of pausing before growth gets going again in that metal.
What about palladium? We've seen this record rise to palladium recently. A little bit of money's been taken off the table. Do you think the turning point has occurred, or are you still into this as a metal for further upside?
Well, definitely for the next few years, because you use more palladium in the autocatalyst for petrol engines, and so the growth in hybrid vehicles, and hybrids are nearly always petrol battery combinations, and also if you're starting an engine that's cold, you need more palladium in the catalyst to make sure it operates well under cold conditions. So that engine is stop, start, stop, start. And in fact, I would recommend to anyone to hit the off button on the eco switch, because it's better if that engine is running a bit more consistently. You don't really want to be turning engines on and off all the time. If you're stopping for more than 5 minutes, sure, but if you're only stopping for 30 seconds, keep the engine running. The emissions will be better from it. And I'm not suggesting we should be cheating the emission systems here, but I mean, I think this is better practice for everyone. And so I do see good ongoing demand for palladium. It's very fundamentally supported. And whilst platinum prices are so low, you need the basket price of PGMs to be relatively good to support the platinum mining industry. Otherwise there'll just be less of it about.
I want to move on to the moon if I can, because I've seen these reports the last couple of days and I had to check to make sure it wasn't a report on the 1st of April about mining on the moon. But I think actually there is this appreciation now that the moon potentially has something to offer in the future, but surely we're talking far too early, aren't we, for any benefit from mining on the moon?
Well, the last time the Americans went to the moon was a long time ago, and they got there and they couldn't see anything of any great value to pick up. I mean, if they'd landed on maybe a fantastic gold mine, they'd have been back there a bit quicker. But they have now identified water on the moon, and so that's a very valuable commodity in space, because you can turn water into oxygen and hydrogen very easily, and that's rocket fuel. And they're also looking at a few other commodities there as well. So commodities that they can then use for 3D printing to build more space infrastructure, more space stations, more rockets, more stuff like that.
On the moon?
Well, they'll build those in space, but they can still, at least, it's easier to get the commodity off the moon and into space than to bring it from Earth. So it's very expensive to get anything into space. And also, I think there's going to be a bit of a gold rush, so to speak, into the asteroid belt for commodity mining. The first thing will be exploration, to see where people can identify, particularly platinum, maybe palladium, other exotic metals, things that are going to be more valuable for space exploration. I'm not suggesting we'll be returning these commodities to Earth in a hurry, but certainly we know well in the mining world that there can be huge value uplift in exploration. So if you had a company that identified a very large deposit of platinum or palladium on an asteroid, you would create great growth, I think, in value, then you'll have to figure out how you're going to actually monetize that later on. But I think investors are going to get quite excited about it.
In my lifetime, or are we talking about something in future generations? And when do you start benefiting, or when do you start looking to benefit from investments in this sort of project, which still seems like indeed it is many, many miles and light years away in some cases?
Well, I'll contextualize this. I know people who've made billions of dollars out of the discovery of deposits 10, 20 years ago that are still not being mined. And I see space as not really that much different. These things will be mined in the future. Discovering them now will create great value uplift, and then some clever people will have to come along behind and figure out how they're actually going to turn that into hard dollars. But I'm sure it will happen.
Yeah. Okay, John, we'll leave it there. But thanks indeed for joining us. Updates on the global economy, what it means to the mining sector, and also taking a look as well at the potential for moon mining.